the entire zodiac is not something that actually exists in the sky. It is an abstraction invented by the Babylonians, and we also know when they invented it and why. That you can read Bethlehem as meaning house of bread. That's actually a later folk etymology. Bethlehem, we know, has been around for thousands of years. The Armada letters from Egypt is called like Bet-Lemud, so it's like the house of some other kind of deity. And then later in Hebrew, it becomes a little bit evolved into the, not quite secular, but at least not carrying an old divine name in it. He realized, okay, I can't look at the sun, obvious reasons why, but I know during a total lunar eclipse, there is perfect alignment between the Earth, the Sun, and the Moon. Hipparchus uses that basic bit of geometric setup and realizes, okay, if I observe the Moon on a total lunar eclipse, and we also want to, though, choose lunar eclipses as close as we can find to the equinoxes.
Welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true gnosis. And today I'm joined by Dr. Adair, and we're going to be going into a little bit more some zeitgeist stuff, continuing from what me and Dr. Bob are getting into. We're going to sort of pick apart the points being made and then talk about some astro-theology. And we got some slides to show you. We got a presentation. This is going to be fun. How's it going, Dr. Aaron?
It's going great here. So for the audience, Happy New Year. I'm glad you all made it here with us. And of course, we're talking astro-theology, history of astronomy and astrology. But right now, I hope you guys are also paying attention to the history of astronomy happening in the skies right now. If you guys have been paying attention, on Christmas Day, we launched a brand new space telescope called the James Webb Space Telescope. It is on its way to its landing spot in space about 1 million miles away.
Wow.
It is a $10 billion science project. And if this thing works as expected, it's going to reveal so much more of the universe. It's basically going to be more than just a Hubble 2.0. It's going to be fantastic stuff. But until that thing is fully deployed, I'm still nervous because if one thing breaks along the way, it's done and there's no way to fix it.
Wow, yeah, no one's going to go out there and be able to fix it. I'll just go on a mission, go fix this. No, that's not happening.
Yeah, we literally do not have the technology to send someone there to fix it. So if it breaks, it's 10 billion down the drain.
10 billion. That's crazy. And
billion with a B.
Which direction is this going towards? Like, is it just going towards this through the solar system, past the planets? Like, is this?
So there are these very fascinating points in the general orbital area around the Earth called the Lagrangian points. These points are basically where like the various gravitational forces and centripetal forces balance out. And if you put something there, it'll basically stay in place. So there's this spot, it's called Lagrange Point 2. It's on the opposite side of the Earth away from the sun, about 1 million miles away from the Earth. And by parking it there, it will fairly naturally stay in that location. So it doesn't have to like constantly fire a rocket to stay in orbit or anything like that.
Right. That's so fascinating. I can't wait to like read about that stuff. But
yeah, there's updates about it like on their Twitter feeds and things like that every day. And they still got about like 5 or 6 months to get to its destination, be fully deployed, take that first picture, and hopefully they took the lead caps off.
Can you imagine that? The guy that's in charge of that?
Shit. People are already making fun of that on Twitter where they have the images in reverse. It's like, please remove before launch.
All right, let's get into the presentation. So I am going to pull this up. And here we are. This is a basic zodiac.
Mm-hmm. All right. So in the film Zeitgeist, the very first thing it discusses is this image, and this being allegedly this ancient representation of what peoples, especially in the Middle East, were using for the creation of the various religions. And it is then, of course, very much like the center point of where all of the theology is supposed to be derived from the Bible, especially the New Testament, some Old Testament as well. And the thing is, the way it describes it, it is at least unclear, but literally taken fundamentally wrong. And that's not a good way to start a documentary, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But I want to make sure that, no one can claim that I am misrepresenting it. So if we want to play the first 30 seconds of part 1 of Zeitgeist.
Let's do that. I'm just going to roll that right now.
This is the sun. As far back as 10,000 BC, history is abundant with carvings and writings reflecting people's respect and adoration for this object. And it is simple to understand why, as every morning the sun would rise, bringing vision, warmth, and security, saving man from the cold, blind, predator-filled darkness of night. Without it, the cultures understood, the crops would not grow, and life on the planet would not survive. These realities made the sun the most adorned object of all time. Likewise, they were also very aware of the stars. The tracking of the stars allowed them to recognize and anticipate events which occurred over long periods of time, such as eclipses and full moons. They in turn cataloged celestial groups into what we know today as constellations. This is the cross of the Zodiac, one of the oldest conceptual images in human history. It reflects the sun as it figuratively passes through the 12 major constellations over the course of a year. It also reflects the 12 months of the year, the 4 seasons, and the solstices and equinoxes. The term zodiac relates to the fact that constellations were anthropomorphized or personified as figures or animals. In other words, the early civilizations did not just follow the sun and stars, they personified them with elaborate myths involving their movements and relationships. The sun, with its life-giving and saving qualities, was personified as a representative of the unseen creator or God. God's son, the light of the world, the savior of humankind. Likewise, the 12 constellations represented places of travel for God's son, and were identified by names, usually representing elements of nature that happened during that period of time. For example, Aquarius, the water bearer, who brings the spring rains.
All right. So when they said this is what everyone believed and what they had, that this is super ancient, the thing is, when you know the history of the astronomy and astrology, that claim doesn't hold up. So instead of just looking at the 12 signs of the zodiac, and I'm highlighting the word signs for a reason, but I'll explain that in a minute, let's take a look at the entire night sky. So this we might want to go full screen for. This is a layout of all of the official 88 constellations in the night sky.
Wow.
Projected out flat, it looks a little bit distorted, especially at the top and bottom, because just like the standard projection of the Earth, you take something flat or round and you lay it out flat, things start to look a little bit weird. But you have all the constellations that the Greeks and Romans knew, as well as a bunch they didn't because they were down in the southern hemisphere. You also see a few interesting features. So, Neil, what sorts of features immediately jump out to you in this image?
Okay, so right immediately I'm looking at the ecliptic, this line throughout the middle, and it seems like on that line are the major constellations, if I'm not mistaken.
Indeed, along the ecliptic is the path of the sun through the sky. You'll find usually the planets following along that line, or at least above and below it a little bit, and it's where you will find the various signs of the zodiac.
Interesting.
So you might see a few noticeable ones. Some of the big ones, like right there in the middle, you see Virgo.
Yep.
To the far right on the ecliptic as well, you can see at least some part of Pisces. The other part of Pisces is sticking around the other end.
Oh, I see. So it's letting you know this is a global.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. There are two things in this world that are not flat: the Earth and the sky.
Yeah. Nice.
So now I have to keep mentioning, though, that these are the 88 constellations, and once you see that, you'll notice a few things that are a bit weird about these constellations. So I'm going to just circle a couple of them in particular. So in red, we have Virgo the Virgin. And in green, which constellation is that, do you think?
Is that Aries?
Yes, it is. Aries the Ram.
Good.
Now, what is interesting about these two is that one is clearly bigger than the other.
Yeah, a lot bigger.
Oh, yeah. In terms of area, as modern constellations, Virgo is about 3 times the area of the sky as is Aries.
Interesting.
Now, that is a little bit weird because if we go back to our zodiac,
they all
exactly all the signs of the zodiac are exactly the same size. Another weird feature here circled in orange. I don't know if you notice what constellation this might be.
Is
It's
that
not as
Scorpio
Scorpio
on
is
the
kind of
bottom?
capturing that as well, but
Oh,
there's a
oh,
much bigger
hold on.
portion.
I'm gonna guess. Ophiuchus.
Ophiuchus or Ophiuchus. I've heard
I'm
multiple
good, aren't I?
pronunciations.
This is
All right, so
an important
now, yeah,
contribution. Go ahead.
yes, and yeah, this is the serpent bearer, but it looks like that constellation intersects the ecliptic, but it's not part of the zodiac.
Now let me ask you this. Let me jump in for 1 second. Isn't this considered the 13th constellation, the forgotten constellation, or something like that? And it used to be considered a constellation. Am I wrong about this? Go
Well,
ahead.
here's the thing. If you talk to an astronomer, that they'll make that point in part to like disparage astrology, saying like the astrologers don't know anything.
Right.
And yes and no about that. But here's the key thing. The mistake, though, is the same mistake in thinking that all of the signs in the zodiac have to be the same as the constellations.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is, the entire zodiac system was a abstraction and simplification of the sky. So instead of there being 13 constellations, or more or less 13 that are intersecting the ecliptic, we're going to have 12. Now,
Wow.
why in the world would we have 12? I can give two good reasons for that. One, in terms of pure math. So in the Babylonian system, they have
60.
their circle at 360 degrees, and it's a whole lot easier to divide by 12 than it is 13.
Right. And they had the
I can
60 they're the ones who invented the 60 base counting system, if I'm not mistaken.
Right, yeah. The base 60 or sexagesimal numerical system.
So
Try saying that 3 times fast.
yes, once again, 12 would be convenient for that system.
Exactly. Yes. So, and of course,
Now-
dividing pretty much anything by 13 is a disaster.
Disaster, right? And now, do you think that this is why we get this sacred number 12 from this system?
Possibly. There's also one other reason you would choose 12. In one calendar year in our system, we have 12 months. 12 moons. 12 complete cycles of the moon in one solar year.
You're good. Okay, that makes sense.
Now, for those listening, you might also have heard, hey, sometimes there's actually also an extra month, a blue moon, when you have 2 full moons in one calendar month. That does happen occasionally. How occasionally? About once in a blue moon.
Nice.
Yeah, somewhat irregularly. But the key thing is, like, in any given solar year, you will have 12 complete phases of the moon, going from full to new to back to full again, and so on. And that's ultimately why we all have like 12 months, 12 moons. Like, the word is about the same in German. It's exactly the same in modern Chinese. There's a reason we did it this way. And because of that sort of simple correlation between what the moon is doing and what the sun is doing throughout the year. Those would be 2 good reasons to have 12 as your base system.
You mentioned the Chinese, and if I'm not mistaken, don't they have its 12 constellation map, or like something like that? Every year there's a new sign. There's 12 of those.
Yeah. So there's a Chinese zodiac as well with 12 signs. But they also have their own system of constellations, completely different than the Western system. In fact, in the Chinese system, they also complicate things where a single star could be an entire constellation. So it doesn't correspond exactly to our Western notion that it has to be a picture in the sky.
Interesting.
But there's also the idea of there being these what are sometimes called lunar mansions as well, of which there are 28. Why are there 28? Because the moon takes 28 days to go completely around the zodiac once.
Interesting.
So there's a multiplicity of systems going on. And so right now, we're still just at the tail end of the year of the bull, or the year of the cow in Chinese. I forget which one comes next. I just remember in particular that this is the year of the cow, because when that happened last time, the word for cow in Chinese is Niu. So people are saying Happy Niu Year.
Nice. And I know they have a year of a dog too.
Oh yeah, dog, dragon, mouse.
Dragon, that's
snake.
probably a big one. Yeah, they love the dragons over there.
Oh yeah. Lots of plenty of animal signs as well. But Zeitgeist is mostly focused on the Babylonian/Western system, and that's the one that, of course, JC is supposed to be fitting into if the story holds. But as you can see, first off, the entire zodiac is not something that actually exists in the sky. It is an abstraction invented by the Babylonians, and we also know when they invented it and why.
Now, I can't help but to think of, so his name's David Talbot, and he runs a YouTube channel called Thunderbolts Project. And
Ah,
it's all about astro-theology, but he makes some really good, interesting contributions to the conversation because he talks about the electromagnetic energy. I'm sorry, I couldn't think of it. He says that
it,
electromagnetic energy causes the constellations to sort of look like there's a color on them. I wonder if
that
you
is not well explained in that sort of way, but now that you've mentioned the Thunderbolts project, now I know what you're talking about, and with the electric universe stuff going on there. And unfortunately,
this is highly
my
tested.
background is physics,
Yeah.
and I know that that stuff is nonsense in terms of physics because it
Oh,
basically
okay.
requires us to not know what gravity is or how it works, or even electromagnetism and how it works, let alone how does the sun work or the stars work. So that is a rabbit hole filled with lots of pseudo rabbits, let's say.
Got you, got you. And I know he's basing a lot of this off Velikovsky's work.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there you go. So this is someone who's highly attested in science, if I'm not mistaken.
Velikovsky, no, unfortunately. Basically, like he's considered like the prime example of a 20th century pseudoscientist.
That's what I was saying. Yeah.
Yeah. But like I say, talking about Velikovskyism and electric universe theory, oh boy, that's a whole presentation all on its own. And
Well,
let's only get
that's why I asked because I figured, someone like me who doesn't know this stuff, I watch his
yeah.
documentaries and it sounds like they're making perfect sense. They're talking about electromagnetic energy. They're talking about they got people with PhDs and doctorates and all that. I'm like, okay, this sounds like it's legit. But that's why I
Yeah.
had on because I want to know this. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's one of those things where it might have that sort of face plausibility, but when you actually like look and do a couple of observations and realize this can't possibly make sense. For example, if they're going to try to replace the entirety of gravitational theory with electromagnetism, it has the problem. Why is it that positive, negative, and neutrally charged objects all fall to the Earth at the exact same rate of acceleration?
Wow.
Things like that don't make sense. In fact, if you try to completely replace gravity with electromagnetism, you can't explain why the Earth formed because
See, I didn't know that these were two conflicting theories, gravity and electromagnetic energy. I thought they can coexist. See, this is where I'm at.
There is in modern physics the attempt to try to unify all of the forces of nature, all the fundamental forces, of which there are four: electromagnetism, the strong and weak nuclear forces, and the gravitational force. And when we say unify them, that they would all look the same in a certain energy regime, a level that we haven't seen since literally the Big Bang.
Wow.
So, in other words, not in your daily experience would you ever confuse gravity and electromagnetism.
Well, I'm glad we got that out the way, and we can go continue with what you're showing us. Let's go.
Cool,
Let's
yeah.
see what else we got here. This is
All right, yeah.
juicy stuff right here, guys.
all right. So where were we? Oh, yes. So the Zodiac itself. So we know who invented it and why, because we can look at the various tablets from the Babylonians and see they're changing the way that they record things in the night sky. In particular, if you want to record things for the long term and predict where they're going to be in the future, you probably need a decent grid system to actually lay out where things are. In the older systems, they'll say like Venus was in front of this constellation or behind this one. That's not terribly exact. There's these gaps between the constellations where it becomes really ambiguous. So by having a system where you've laid out the entire ecliptic with one system where it's also easily divisible mathematically, you've made it a lot easier to have a system to actually do your recordings and predict where things will be in the future. And now when they did that, we can also figure out based on not only do we see like the transition of what they're saying in the tablets to something that looks like our zodiac, but also, we do astronomy, we do physics, we love to do the math. So I have to do some math with you.
Nice.
So this is taken from a paper. We might want to not cover up the citation I have there. Yeah, awesome. So there has been a lot of back and forth in the history of astronomy community about when the zodiac was invented by the Babylonians, and the two camps were basically arguing for about 50 years. But the time frame they were arguing over was pretty small. They were wondering if it's either in 400 BC or about 450 BCE when the zodiac was invented. So a pretty small argument that sounds like, but most importantly, not even 25 centuries ago, not that terribly ancient. And one of the pieces of evidence presented by Britain here in this study from 2010 was looking at the various systems where they try predicting the time and location of the new moon, which is important for the calendar system, because when the new moon is going to happen, that's when the new month is supposed to start, things like that. Just like in the Jewish calendar, you're trying to look for the first sliver of the moon to say when like Nisan 1st is, things like that.
Interesting.
So in this setup, what they were doing is they looked at this particular tablet and the system of how they were trying to predict where the moon was. And this tablet also gives like the ratios of like the speed of things changing. So literally it gives us the equation that they use to calculate where the moon will be.
Wow.
And because they give us the numbers, we can also check that against reality and see how big of an error there is and see as that discrepancy grows and grows over time. The bigger your error is, the more quickly those are going to diverge, which also means if they're using this sort of system, we can also figure out when did they create this in the first place? Because when you first invent it, you're probably going to have almost no error between your predictions and reality, because you can look right now and see, yep, that's right, or whoops, that's wrong.
True.
And so this sort of graph, the blue line here, they're calling system A2, it's a modification of another system, and it's the one that's used in this tablet. And you can see that the error level is basically about 0. It says here negative 400. In this system, negative 400 corresponds to 401 BC. Because the fact there's no 0 in our AC-BC system, I said almost AC-DC. In our AC-BC system, there's no 0. So this is just a way to, again, to make it easier to like plug into a computer and calculate things. So like around the year 400, the error is 0. And you can see that the error grows fairly quickly. After about 5 years, you have an error of about 3 degrees, which is kind of noticeable. And if you went back 50 years, that error would be 10 times as big. A 30-degree error is huge. Anyone's going to notice that who has eyes to see.
Right.
So this was one of the lines of evidence that this paper used. You know, they literally did the math and said, this must be approximately when they made the system because of the equations they used.
Interesting. Wow, that's fascinating stuff.
Yeah, so that's the one thing I love about like the history of science, especially in astronomy, because we can literally do the math and figure out when they were doing things and how they were doing it, because they've spelled it out for us. We don't have to guess and check things where it's like, well, maybe they modified this word, or they're doing a pun here, or they're just making things up like so much else in history. We can literally plug it into a computer and see the reality of it. It's always a wonderful thing to happen. And I'm also, yeah.
I'm guessing there you can make predictions, and these predictions turn out to be right a lot of time based on what we know and based on what we can project. And which is like, this is science. I mean, the historical method is science, basically.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Basically, science is much like the historical method. It's just usually we have better data.
Yeah.
We don't have such exact calculations in Josephus, okay?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. All right. This is cool.
So the whole point of this at this point here is to try to show that the Zodiac system is an invention. It is not an obvious thing that you just look up in the sky and see.
Right.
It was a creation by scholars in a particular time, and it doesn't have anywhere near the antiquity that Zeitgeist would first think it has.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. This is really important because you get the impression a lot of times when people are talking about the ancient religions, the ancient pagan religions, that this Zodiac was just central the whole time, going back thousands of years, and the Babylonians invented it, and the Egyptians had a version of it, and this is what people think. This is what I just thought 10 minutes ago.
Yeah, and it's important that basically the Babylonians invented it, and the Egyptians and the Greeks only really get handled on this pretty much after the conquest of Alexander the Great.
Wow. That makes perfect sense too, because what he does is he sort of globalizes the civilized world at the time.
Exactly. Yeah.
And
connects that whole world together. Yep. Yeah, and then the Egyptians, they take it, they start adapting it, and the astrological systems that the Babylonians developed, in Hellenized Egypt, they would develop it more into the form that will become common in the Western system, which eventually then the Greeks and Romans check out and think, oh, all this great knowledge from ancient Egypt that we're going to now, pick up and run with, because it has the air of antiquity to it.
Nice.
First of all, the birth sequence is completely astrological. The star in the east is Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, which, on December 24th, aligns with the 3 brightest stars in Orion's belt. These 3 bright stars in Orion's belt are called today what they were called in ancient times, the 3 kings. And the 3 kings and the brightest star, Sirius, all point to the place of the sunrise on December 25th. This is why the 3 kings follow the star in the east, in order to locate the sunrise. the birth of the sun.
Yeah.
This might be the thing that grabbed my attention the most from Zeitgeist and made me mad. Because it gets some things a little bit right, some things very wrong, and they clearly could have checked it and didn't. So,
Now, I'm glad you brought this up early. Well, it's not early in, but I'm glad you brought this up now, because this is where me and Dr. Bob sort of were left a question mark, because we saw this part in the movie and we said, this is interesting. Dr. Bob pointed out that the Bible doesn't say anything about three kings. So right off the bat, you know, this is a sort of a lazy presentation, because they didn't even go to the text. They just assumed that everyone is talking about three kings, but it's not three kings. It's three magi. Now, but we also were wondering if this still is possible if if the Orion's belt lines up with the sun on this winter solstice. And you're going to answer that right now.
All right. So let's start off with the king's business, because it's worth doing that. So these are the three stars of the belt of Orion. No, again, the belt. So where in the world is the idea that these are kings coming from? If we go to the official names of these stars, they actually come from Arabic. It's really weird that a lot of the constellations, their names come from Greco and Roman myth, but the star names are Arabic, because the Arabs basically were the ones that preserved a lot of the science from antiquity and then worked on that. And then when the Europeans in the Latin West got their act together and decided, hey, maybe we should learn something again, it was basically preserved in Arabic texts. And then that's when they started translating these things in the 12th, 13th centuries and discovered, oh wow, we're really behind the times, guys. They have this thing called Aristotle.
Yeah, Aristotle. And the Arabs at the time were very interested in Aristotle's work.
Yeah, and the only way they could interpret Aristotle, because honestly, reading the works of Aristotle is kind of hard, they basically had to work with the commentaries provided by the various Arabic sources, so that way it was even possible to do Aristotelian philosophy.
Wow. And this is, by the way, Aristotle. For anyone who doesn't know, just real quick, let me just show. This is the basic works of Aristotle. Do you see how thick this is? This is like a Bible. And this is only what survived. Who knows how much there really was plus this. And the reason I bring that up is because there's so much information to be known in Aristotle's works. And it's not until like we were just talking about, the Arabs tried to preserve his work on it. In the West, they sort of forgot about him until I think it's Thomas Aquinas brings it back to life in the church. And then all of a sudden they're like, they love Aristotle all of a sudden, which is interesting. But go ahead.
Aquinas was kind of a midway house, because when Aristotle was rediscovered, some people absolutely loved what he was doing. Some people despised it. Some of it was even like banned to teach, or like certain teachings of Aristotle were banned at the universities. Right. Aquinas was trying to find a way to integrate it into the Catholic tradition and his theological system, because some things Aristotle believed were completely incompatible with Christianity, such as the eternity of the universe.
Right. And it's funny because not only is that wrong, but a lot of stuff that Aristotle talks about that sounded scientific at the time, we now know is just complete bunk.
Yeah.
It's just...
Yeah. It's also unfortunate that a lot of the stuff that Aristotle thought was debunked even before the end of the Roman Empire, but because a lot of that stuff didn't get preserved or wasn't passed on to the medieval Europeans, they thought that Aristotle was the pinnacle, when really he was the beginning of science in so many ways.
You and Richard Carrier both told me. I've heard that exactly said by Richard Carrier, which is interesting. So that's awesome. That's good to know.
All right. Oh, so before we get too far off the track, because we're having too much fun. So those three stars, the name, their official designations actually comes from Arabic. And the names going from left to right there is Alnitak, Al-Nelam, and Mintaka. Mintaka. There we go. Now, I'm not going to expect everyone to have memorized their Arabic vocabulary, but basically they're all different words for belt or girdle. So to the Arabs, they're belt stars because it's the belt of Orion. Where in the world are they being called kings? And when I've tried looking for sources for this, they're all late Christian sources, clearly imposing the Bible story onto the stars at a later date. Like when I look at one common source people look at for what is it, Richard Allen's book on the names of the stars, and he says like in Germany and Denmark they call it either the three kings, the three magi, the three Marys. So it's clearly like, oh, Northern Europeans at a later date doing that. I think Peter Joseph in his source book, he'll point to a source from South Africa saying that they're kings, but when it looked at it and it said, wait, Dry Koenig, that's not Swahili, that's Afrikaans. Again, a European language because South Africa was controlled by the Dutch and then later the English.
And they taught, and that's the language called Afrikaans. Okay.
Yeah, Afrikaans is a descendant of Dutch, basically, or at least Dutch related.
So funny. And then he just assumed that it's called Afrikaans, so it must be African.
Or at the very least, not looking at the words there and realizing it's a European, it's European vocabulary, not native African vocabulary.
Wow.
So all the sources calling it kings are late European, almost certainly Christians, imposing onto there, because I can't find any actual ancient source that calls it that.
But the problem still lies here, and this is what I tried to bring up to Dr. Bob. Even if the words don't, even if, so if there's a possibility that if someone's writing the story, it doesn't matter if they call it kings or call it magi, they can still be referring to three stars pointing to the birth of the sun.
I've only touched the surface of what got me angry. So,
okay. All right, let's go.
The alignment here. All right. So is it true that the belt stars of Orion generally point in the direction of Sirius? Yes.
Ooh. Interesting.
Do they point to the rising of the sun? Let's go back to our star map.
Oh, there we go. That's not good. If this answer is no, then sorry.
It's better to just have not just a yes or no, but let's literally, work together and science together what's going on here.
Let's do it.
So again, this looks like a total mess. It might be really hard to find anything interesting. So here I have circled our friend Orion.
Wow.
Now, the first thing you'll notice is what is his relative location to the ecliptic.
Inside your circle, you see Orion's belt. The three stars or the three dots are not in parallel to where the sun would can't stand up. So it's almost impossible for them to point to the sun because they're pointing in a different direction where the sun's location's going. So how could they point to the sun? Right?
Mm-hmm.
That's true.
Exactly.
Okay.
So here I have the three stars pointing to, or at least in the direction of Sirius.
Now I'm glad you're showing it. Okay, good.
Yes.
So they can't point to the sun ever, and it's impossible.
At least not so simple as was shown there, where the sun is right below the horizon of Sirius, because the sun is never there ever.
Yeah, the sun never goes in that part. So
it's also a bit weird because the way they describe it when they talk about the three kings following the star in the east, the thing is, if you actually are watching the stars throughout the night, you will see Orion rise and then Sirius. If anything, Sirius is chasing after the belt.
All right, so let's ask this. This is the big kahuna right here. Where does the sun rise on December 25th in the sky?
I have that up on our slide here. That big yellow dot I included. That's where the sun is on December 25th, right around the time of Jesus's birth.
So we got Orion's over here on the right. The sun's all the way over here.
Yep.
It's pointing nowhere near the sun.
Now, there's a couple of things here to note. One is Orion is what is called one of the winter constellations, which is a way of saying that it's up in the nighttime sky all night long during the winter. It also means that Orion and Sirius have set before the sun even rises. You couldn't even possibly see it point to where the sun is because the pointers are all gone by the time of sunrise.
So this is just made up then.
It's now there's a complication.
What about the Crux constellation?
The Crux constellation, or the Southern Cross, basically is really hard to see, or almost impossible to see from northern latitudes. So
if anyone's watching, when you see that 12H, right, ascension, just look a little bit above that and you'll see a CRU. There's your Crux constellation. As you can see, the sun doesn't even go on the Crux constellation.
That's right.
And this is what he's saying. This is what he said later on in the. Are you getting to this point or no?
Oh, we will. But
Okay, let's
he
wait for
actually
it.
he argues something else. Not so much the crux constellation, but actually looking at like a horoscope. But we'll get to that too. Don't you worry. Don't you
All
worry.
right, all right.
Now there is a complication here. Remember how I said this is actually the night sky? It's round, but wow, we flattened it out. So straight lines are all crooked, like the ecliptic is all wavy.
Yeah.
So if we wanted to do this thoroughly and wanted to see where that line points and see where it intersects with the ecliptic, we probably need to do some actual better geometry. Because, for example, you could see if we were following the line from Sirius through the belt, it goes to the ecliptic somewhere in Taurus. And because these two lines all wrap around the sky, eventually they'll intersect in another spot. So I wanted to investigate and see where that point is. So instead of doing it with this projection, which is called a Mercator projection, I went to a different one using some planetarium software. So this I screenshotted from some planetarium software called Stellaria. I use it for two reasons. One, it looks really nice. Two, it's free. And that's the most important second reason.
By the way, anyone who's watching, this is so fun to play around with these things. You can
Oh yeah,
like a little universe sandbox. You can look around and look at everything. It's so cool.
oh yeah. Now, the software is also good that it allows me to change the kind of projection. Basically, there are so many different ways you can take a round object like the Earth or the night sky, the celestial sphere, we'll call it, and then try to flatten it out. And you'll distort it in different ways and preserve other features. So, for example, in the standard one that I had in the previous slide, what is kept in place are basically the parallelness of what are called the declension lines, basically the lines of latitude for the night sky. In this one, this is called stereographic projection, which means that angles of intersections are preserved.
Oh, wow.
And now I chose that, and also this particular angle, so that way when I try creating a line through the belt stars of Orion through Sirius, it should be, to our eyes, a nice and straight line rather than these curves, and then we can try to see where it intersects. Now, I had to kind of eyeball this along the way, but by adding a line.
Yes.
Boom.
Nice. Wow.
So,
good work.
So this is a bit approximate for a couple of reasons. One is actually the stars of the belt of Orion aren't in a perfect line anyways. The star on the far right, Mintaka, is actually a little bit above where the other two stars would make a line. So how you even form a line through Sirius, there's a little bit of wiggle room. But nonetheless, we are in the region of it pointing, it looks like in the constellation of, Scorpius, somewhere in that region. And again, I've projected the sky for what it looks like as seen from near Jerusalem in 6 BCE. And the sun will be at that location in late October, early November. In other words, nowhere near the solstices or the equinoxes.
Dude, you're really debunking astro-theology right now.
At least this one part. So,
dude, but this is good work. Like we're demonstrating how we can prove these things and not just speculate.
Exactly. And the thing is, though, it still begs the question where the mistake happened. So when I go back to Acharya's work in her book, The Christ Conspiracy, she doesn't quite say the same thing, or at least not clearly what is presented in Zeitgeist. And in her later editions, where she's trying to flesh things out a little bit better, she'll definitely get some things that are important that are right. For example, Sirius is absolutely important to the Egyptians. Orion is absolutely important to the Egyptians. And in particular, the first time you will see Sirius rising in the sky just before the sun, called a heliacal rising, that is also coinciding with the inundation of the Nile. So it's super important to the Egyptians because when you see Sirius, that's the sign that the Nile is going to start flooding again.
Is Osiris connected to Sirius? Is there a linguistic connection there? Is this the same? Is there anything going on there, or is it just a coincidence?
That I would have to check into, because more often than not, Sirius will be associated with Isis and Orion with Osiris. So
interesting.
Though it does get a little bit mixed up because
there is that they are sort of a godhead in a way. They do show that they conflate the two a lot.
Yeah, and of course when we talk about it, and of course when we say Egyptian religion, we also have to pause and say, wait a minute, Egyptian religion has lasted longer than the entire history of Christianity.
Plus, the lower Egypt and upper Egypt had different religions going on, so there might be different conflations too. So you have to, there's a lot
of various local cults and things like that. So when someone says Egyptian religion, I have to say, wait, Old Kingdom, New Kingdom, Ptolemaic.
Good point. There's a lot going on.
It's wonderfully complicated.
Yep.
But what is clear is what is presented in Zeitgeist is faulty, and what is true about Sirius doesn't correspond to anything about the winter solstice, sun rising, or anything like that. Yeah,
Hey.
it's just not correct.
Yeah, and that's important that we
Yeah. The
we
best I
see-
can guess of what may have happened is that because Sirius is supposed to be having this, what is going to call the heliacal rising, it's rising just before the sun. So in a way, the Sirius and the sun are aligned in that they're rising at close to the same time. And maybe that's where this confusion came from, but this is a little bit of guesswork on my part.
Interesting. Yep. And I think it's really important that we get this right, because if we're going to try to debunk the Bible or charge them with astro-theology and being pagan, we better be right too. Because if we're wrong, then now we look like the idiots. We look like the apologists now. You know what I mean? And this is good.
Exactly.
This is good stuff right here.
All right. So those, like I said, that alignment, I first noticed being a problem years ago. I made a YouTube video about it, and I had a bunch of people from Zeitgeist or Acharya S forums come and like get really angry about that, and made all sorts of wild claims that said, no, what actually happened there, I've seen it. And I'm like, no, you haven't.
You know what's
what
funny
you just said
that?
is astronomically impossible.
Peter Joseph, I'm actually going to show this on the screen right now. This is a little debacle we had on Twitter. I was trying to be as nice as possible.
Yeah.
Because I actually do. I kind of, I like the guy. I think he's, he's whatever. But he immediately was like, you don't even know. Here's my sources. And then he shows me his sources, probably thinking that I wasn't going to click on it and look. And I look at the sources, and it's just Acharya S and like
Massey, I think a lot as well.
Yeah, and it's like pictures of his movie in there. I'm like, this is not like you realize I can look this up and check what you're talking. And I don't know. He thought that was gonna shut me up, but I'm like, dude, this is not legit. Like, sorry, man. Like, I actually wanted you to be right. This is juicy stuff right here. This would be awesome if you were right. But we can't just make stuff up because we don't like religion. You know what I mean? It's not right. You can't do that.
And of course, conversely, we can't just make stuff up to create a new religion, which seems to be happening more and more with the young folks, where they're taking the bits they like about astrology and basically creating their own personal new agey narrative.
That's such a good point, because I've seen in these new age circles on Facebook groups where they actually use zeitgeist stuff and they think it's cool. And they're like, there's something deeper going on with the solstices. Yeah. This is actually turning into more of an apology thing than Christianity itself. Interesting.
Yeah, it's just another new form of ultimately magical thinking where the metaphors you create become the new reality.
Yeah. It's fascinating that we do this.
Oh, and of course, speaking of metaphors, then one of the other claims coming up, again, relating back to astrology and to our friend Constellation Virgo. I mentioned Virgo earlier, and Virgo is very important in Zeitgeist, and I believe there's a clip about that.
The Virgin Mary is the constellation Virgo, also known as Virgo the Virgin. Virgo in Latin means virgin. The ancient glyph for Virgo is the altered M. This is why Mary, along with other virgin mothers, such as Adonis's mother Myra or Buddha's mother Maya, begin with an M. Virgo is also referred to as the house of bread, and the representation of Virgo is a virgin holding a sheaf of wheat. This house of bread, and its symbol of wheat, represents August and September, the time of harvest. In turn, Bethlehem, in fact, literally translates to house of bread. Bethlehem is thus a reference to the constellation Virgo, a place in the sky, not on Earth.
So, talks about Virgo being the house of bread, being the virgin, somehow connecting to the story of the birth of Jesus, etc., etc. So, let's go through this. Where's this whole house of bread business coming from? So, Virgo has an important bright star in it called Spica, and when Virgo is depicted, she's usually shown holding grains of wheat in her hand that corresponds to the location of the star Spica. Now, wheat is used for bread, so this makes her all bread, some bread, a house. There's some leaps here to make those connections.
Yeah.
And Of course, indeed, yes, Virgo the Virgin is supposed to be a virgin, but again, depends on which astrological or astronomical system you want. If you go back to the constellations as used by the Babylonians, she's not a virgin. She's called the Furrows. She's something related to agriculture as well, but not the same thing as a virgin. So again, it sounds like we're mixing a few things together here to get this analogy to work.
But to be fair, it is interesting that it is an agricultural constellation. Mm-hmm. So there's something there. It's just they're drawing. I think they're taking something that's so little and so basic as an agricultural deity or a constellation, and then boom, let's make it this.
Yes. And then, of course, it's also the case that you can read Bethlehem as meaning house of bread. That's actually a later folk etymology in the Armana letters where they first mentioned Bethlehem. So Bethlehem, we know, has been around for thousands and thousands of years. And in the Armana letters from Egypt, it's called like Bet-Lemu. So it's like the house of some other kind of deity. And then later in Hebrew, it becomes a little bit evolved into the not quite secular, but at least not carrying an old divine name in it. To become house of bread.
Bethlehem literally means house bread.
Yes.
So, I mean, there's...
Yeah, in the same way, Bet Shemesh will be house of the sun.
Right. Interesting.
Yeah. So that's how they're trying to connect. It's like, here's the house of bread town. Let's connect it to this constellation that has wheat in it, but it's also supposed to be a woman, so it's also the virgin birth. Again, we're trying to get a lot of things crammed into here, and the only thing holding together is basically one star that is often depicted as grains of wheat. It's a lot of stretching, and it ultimately misses the point. Why is Bethlehem even mentioned? And it's supposed to be fulfilling Old Testament prophecies, not fitting things in the sky.
Yeah, that's a good point. Is that the reason why he's born in Bethlehem is because David's born in Bethlehem, and this is what the Jews at the time were saying, that there would be a new David, a son of David in a way. So they're trying to connect the dots there rather than saying, look, it's born of a virgin. Like, I don't know. It's interesting though, that it's interesting that he would think that they're trying to do both at the same time. Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm trying to see what he's trying to go, you know?
Yeah, but it's also a bit forced as well, because if we're trying to explain the origins of Christianity, it fails because the idea that Jesus was born in Bethlehem isn't in Paul. It's not in Mark. The virgin birth isn't in those sources either. It's only something we first find in Matthew. So it's a later development.
Right. That's a good point. Good point.
Yeah. So if we want to describe the origins of Christianity, we can't explain something that came 50 plus years after the origins.
Yeah, I always stress on that, is like, try to remember the chronology of the text. Remember that Paul came first, then Mark. You know, just stuff you got to keep in mind when you're trying to understand the origins of all this stuff.
Yes. And then, of course, if you go on later and you get to John, and he's like, can anything good come out of Nazareth? And the idea that's like, wait, I thought the Messiah was coming out of Bethlehem. It's like, either John doesn't know that Jesus came from Bethlehem, or he's just like, I don't even care about the tradition. I'm throwing it away. It has nothing for me. And again, if it's supposed to have all this great astro-theological importance, and John is just like, whatever, it may not be that important.
Right. Yep. That's true.
Now, there's also an interesting feature about Virgo that was brought up, was also the astrological symbol used for Virgo, looking like an M with an extra like swirly thing on the end.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a fish.
Me and Dr. Bob are wondering where the M comes from. Is this a later thing? What is this?
So, because I want to do some digging, and it's really hard to find like good sources describing the origins and evolutions of these glyphs for the zodiac signs. But one of the books I was able to find is this book by Van Heersen and Neugebauer, like two other like really important people for like the history of astronomy and the exact sciences. Their book is simply titled Greek Horoscopes, going through like all the horoscopes that they had access to at that time. And also, when looking at the manuscripts, we can look at the evolution of some of these things. So on the top row here of this table I've taken from them, that's the form of the glyphs that we'd see by roughly the Renaissance in Europe. Below that are earlier versions.
Wow.
So now, right there in the middle, I think you can find our friend Virgo on the top. Again, looks like an M with a little extra swirly thing on the end.
Right away, yep.
Below that are the earlier forms. Do those look like M's to you?
No, they look like they're upside down or something.
Yeah, something else has changed. I can't tell if it's like an omega and a chi symbol or something else. I haven't really figured out what it's supposed to be. Maybe it's just like an acronym, so it's like omega and a chi for something else, but I haven't quite figured out why that might be, but nonetheless, it's clearly not an M.
Right. No, that's a good point.
And also, when it comes to the antiquity of these symbols, I mentioned that version of the signs that I have in that top row are basically Renaissance period or later. The earliest we have any of these glyphs for the zodiac signs are in Byzantine manuscripts.
Yeah.
So we're talking 400-500 years after the time of JC. And I'll give you an example. Here is an example of one of those horoscopes that we actually have preserved. This one is from, what did I write? 479 CE. So
and there it is. There's the
years.
upside down or omega, as you pointed out. It looks more like an omega with a chi tail on it.
Exactly.
It's very strange because there's no alpha and omega thing going on. It's omega.
Yeah, it is. I have not come up with a good explanation, and nothing in the book that I had pulled any of these things from actually explains that either. Their focuses were elsewhere, but this example, like showing one of the earliest examples we have of using the glyphs, and you can definitely see it is not the M form. We see that only much, much later. Why did they do that? Yeah, it almost looks like they flipped it over. Maybe they also chose M, so that way it sounds like the word maiden for virgin, but that is speculative. We really don't know for sure. At least I haven't found a definitive answer to that question. What I can say is it doesn't explain what we see, and even if it were the M and it were ancient, it doesn't even explain the points well. When they try to say, well, there's Mary, there's Maya, all these goddesses that give birth, it's like, wait, hold on. I thought earlier we were talking about Isis, not Mysis.
Right.
So it's like, if we're going to try to explain all the goddesses with just the letter M, the most prominent example of a goddess giving birth to the figure that's really important in Zeitgeist doesn't have the important feature that this wants. So again, it's only picking a few examples, missing the forest for the trees, and not realizing the long, complicated history of the symbols used.
Yeah, that's such a good point. Yeah. Wow, you're doing good. Let's keep this thing going. This is awesome.
All right. So perhaps the, coup de grace for using astro-theology for here is then the section when they talk about the precession of the equinoxes.
There's another very interesting phenomenon that occurs around December 25th, or the winter solstice. From the summer solstice to the winter solstice, the days become shorter and colder. And from the perspective of the northern hemisphere, the sun appears to move south and get smaller and more scarce. The shortening of the days and the expiration of the crops when approaching the winter solstice symbolize the process of death to the ancients. It was the death of the sun. And by December 22nd, the sun's demise was fully realized, for the sun, having moved south continually for 6 months, makes it to its lowest point in the sky. Here a curious thing occurs. The sun stops moving south, at least perceivably, for 3 days. And during this 3-day pause, the sun resides in the vicinity of the Southern Cross, or Crux, constellation. And after this time, on December 25th, the sun moves 1 degree, this time north, foreshadowing longer days, warmth, and spring. And thus it was said, the sun died on the cross, was dead for 3 days, only to be resurrected or born again. This is why Jesus and numerous other sun gods share the crucifixion, 3-day death, and resurrection concept. It is the sun's transition period before it shifts its direction back into the northern hemisphere, bringing spring and thus salvation. However, they did not celebrate the resurrection of the sun until the spring equinox, or Easter. This is because at the spring equinox, the sun officially overpowers the evil darkness, as daytime thereafter becomes longer in duration than the night, and the revitalizing conditions of spring emerge. In order to understand this, we need to be familiar with a phenomenon known as the precession of the equinoxes. The ancient Egyptians, along with cultures long before them, recognized that approximately every 2150 years, the sunrise on the morning of the spring equinox would occur in a different sign of the zodiac. This has to do with a slow, angular wobble that the Earth maintains as it rotates on its axis. It is called a precession because the constellations go backwards rather than through the normal yearly cycle. The amount of time it takes for the precession to go through all 12 signs is roughly 25,765 years. This is also called the Great Year. And ancient societies were very aware of this, and they referred to each 2150-year period as an age. From 4300 BC to 2150 BC, it was the age of Taurus, the bull. From 2150 BC to 1 AD, it was the age of Aries, the ram. And from 1 AD to 2150 AD, it is the age of Pisces, the age we are still in to this day. And in and around 2150, we will enter the new age, the age of Aquarius. Now Jesus is the figure who ushers in the age following Aries, the age of Pisces, or the two fish. Fish symbolism is very abundant in the New Testament. Jesus feeds 5,000 people with bread and 2 fish.
So I forget how well they actually describe the science of it, but basically when you have an object that's spinning and it has any asymmetry to its mass distribution and there's a constant force on it, not only will it spin, but the axis will actually slowly adjust itself. So the Earth, in what we call the precession of the equinoxes, it is ultimately an effect of the axis of the Earth slowly moving from its location and going in this extra circle.
Right.
A circle that takes roughly 27-ish thousand years to complete.
Wow. Now I will say this: I was personally wanted to find out where this comes from. The oldest text that I found, and you might be able to top me on this, Seneca, the horse historian. I think he's from the 1st century, right? Seneca.
Mm-hmm.
He writes about this precession of the equinox, which lets me know that it was at least known about by the 1st century. But this could have been something different. I don't know if he was even talking about the same thing or not. Let's see if you answer this.
He is, because we know explicitly who discovered the precession of the equinoxes in our buddy Ptolemy in his Almagest, or his
Syntheticus. I never read that before. So there you go.
Well, okay, it's not exactly an easy read. I got a copy right here in English, fortunately.
Nice.
And it's filled with diagrams. I mean, heck, not only does it go through like all sorts of observations, and demonstrations, like he talks about like how you like build an armillary sphere and things like that to do your own observations. He gives historical observations of other things, so he shows you how he did his math. It's big, it's complicated, and thank goodness it's in English. This was translated by J.G. Toomer. It's basically like the standard that everyone goes to for a translation.
Wow.
If anyone gives you something else, tell them it's not a Tuma.
How much is that, by the way? I'm just curious.
Oh, that's a good question. I know I got this thing used, so hopefully I didn't pay more than $50 for it, but I honestly don't know what it's on Amazon right now. You'd have to check that.
Yeah, okay.
But he basically, talks about Hipparchus making these observations to make the discovery of the precession of the equinoxes. And I'd like to talk a bit about how that is done. So first off, what is an equinox?
An equinox is the where the sun goes in the direction of the. How do you explain it? I don't know. I failed. Sorry.
No worries. Don't worry. We're going to science together today.
Yeah.
So the simple definition that you'll often hear is the equinox is when there is equal amounts of day and night. So when you have 12 hours a day, 12 hours of night, that they are equal, the equinox, noctis.
Oh, that's what the word means. Equinox. Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
It is not the most precise definition, because it could be the case that the equinox will happen at a moment where it's like midnight for you, so you didn't even notice the sun at all. So a more exacting definition is the intersection point between 2 imaginary circles out in space.
Okay.
One of these circles is called the celestial equator. So our Earth is nice and round. If you don't think that, get out of the comments. But if you imagine projecting out Earth's equator, that becomes the celestial equator on the celestial sphere that we can imagine. And then we have the ecliptic. Where those two intersect will take place at 2 points. One is called the vernal equinox. The other one is the autumnal equinox. For here, us in the northern hemisphere, the vernal equinox is the first day of spring, and when the days are now coming longer and longer beyond 12 hours until we get to the summer solstice, when it's the longest day of the year. Autumnal equinox, again, equal day and night, and then the days get shorter and shorter from that point. If you're in the southern hemisphere, flip all that.
Interesting. Now that
go ahead.
Now let me just ask this, because it seems pretty obvious that there's a connection between the equinox and these holidays like Easter or the solstice and Christmas, is there something at least going on there, or is this because I mean, why else do all these religions and all these different ancient faiths have holidays right around these times?
Part of it is that they are connected to like other agricultural festivals. So basically, everyone wants to have a party once you've completed the really big harvest. And especially like if that harvest is wheat and now you can make the first good batches of beer, that's a good reason to start celebrating.
Right.
So a lot of that is dictated by agriculture, which is ultimately dictated by the season. So it does come to the sun, at least to some degree. But to what degree that people were celebrating explicitly the solstices, that is less clear, especially because we might talk about this later, of just how important or unimportant the sun was in a lot of these ancient cultures. But I'll save that for a little bit later.
Okay.
So the key thing is this. In Zeitgeist, they are talking about the precession of the equinoxes. The key thing is that because of the wobble of the Earth, that intersection point between the celestial equator and the ecliptic slightly shifts every year, a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. And so it moves through the zodiac. Right now, the vernal equinox is in the constellation Pisces, and it is slowly making its way towards Aquarius.
Aquarius, yep.
And those of you who know the song Dawning of the Age of Aquarius, it's that sort of astrological theory behind it, that eventually the vernal equinox will move into that sign. And again, notice I said sign, not constellation. We're using the astrology system.
Right.
And so we know that this shift is happening. We know who discovered it. And we also know why it had to be Hipparchus doing it and not someone much, 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 much earlier, which again would kind of assume that Zeitgeist does, that there's just this ancient astronomical knowledge that goes back many thousands of years, even before Christianity. Because here's the thing. It's not springtime right now, but Neil, if I asked you to go outside and take a look at the sun and tell me what constellation it's in, what will happen?
It's going to be different every day, and it's depending on time of the year.
True, true. So specifically, if you go out on May 21st and you look at the sun and see what sign it's in, what will happen?
During May?
March 21st. That's the vernal equinox approximately.
That wouldn't that be Pisces? No, oh, I'm sorry, Virgo?
It'll be in Pisces that time.
Pisces.
But I'm saying you go and physically look at the sun and see what sign it's in.
Oh, you can't. Is that what you're getting at? You can't see it.
Exactly.
Okay, I see what you're saying now.
So the thing is,
you can't see the constellations.
Yeah, especially during the day. And remember, also in this astrological system, the signs aren't the constellations. So that's a double whammy of what you can't see. There's literally, the zodiac doesn't exist physically. And also, if you try looking, you're not going to have eyes with your done because you just started staring at the sun.
Such a good point that I never thought about.
So it's actually then the problem of actually figuring out where is the sun on the vernal equinox and how can you tell it's moving? Because if you try looking at the sun, you're going to be in trouble in 1 minute.
Right. Now, to be fair, to play devil's advocate and fight for Peter Joseph for a second, wouldn't you just sort of point out at nighttime you can see which? Well, no, you can't see because you don't know this. Again, you can't see the sun at nighttime. So yeah, and this is a problem. You're right.
Exactly.
No,
Exactly.
You can't. How do you know this?
Yeah, there's no simple observation that you could just do with the sun like that. So we need instead to look at things we actually can see without burning our eyes out.
Right. So let me see if I can figure this out. At nighttime, you can see where the constellations are.
Mm-hmm.
Then what you would do is you would track when the sun starts to rise. You can sort of gauge based on where you're looking at the stars. You have them mapped out, and they're moving because the night sky is always moving. But when the sun starts to rise, you can sort of gauge where you were at when the sun was rising. Can't you do that?
Possibly. Now, do you think that'll be a precise method?
No, absolutely not. You'd have to guess. Because as soon as
the sun
starts to come up, you start losing your spot in the sky immediately.
Exactly, yeah. And if we want to do this, we need precision because the rate of precession, as we measure today, very precisely, it's about every 72 years, that intersection point moves 1 degree. So 1 degree spread out over 72 years. In other words, it's small and it's subtle. So if you're going to pick it up, you need a method that can measure down to less than a degree. And the method you describe probably would be too noisy to get really good measurements that way.
That's a good point. Yeah.
So we need something we can look at where we know its exact relationship with the sun.
Now, couldn't you use another planet, maybe?
You could. Planets, though, then you'll have to have a very complicated planetary theory about where they're going to be, and the planets can always be above and below the ecliptic. It's quite messy. We need to know an object exactly opposite the sun, basically. So it's not in the glare of the sun. And if we also know it's exactly opposite the sun, then we know, well, that's 180 degrees apart. So if we can locate where that object is, subtract 180, we know where the sun is. What could we do for that?
You can't do the moon because the moon is completely on its own course compared to the sun. I don't know. What do you do? That's a good question.
Aren't there times, though, when the Earth, sun, and moon are aligned?
Oh, you are smart. So you would use a eclipse.
And which kind?
A lunar eclipse.
Bingo.
That's awesome.
You are now on the same page as Hipparchus was.
Yeah.
This is exactly what he did. He realized, okay, I can't look at the sun, obvious reasons why, but I know during a total lunar eclipse, there is perfect alignment between the Earth, the sun, and the moon. They already knew that the basics of the fact that the reason the moon changes color like that or has the shape that it does is the Earth is blocking the light of the sun. This is something that Aristotle talks about, one of his proofs that the Earth is round, that you see the shadow of the Earth on the moon and see, hey, that's round.
Wow.
So Hipparchus uses that basic bit of geometric setup and realizes, okay, if I observe the moon on a total lunar eclipse, and we want a total lunar eclipse, so that way the moon isn't just slightly behind the Earth, we want it like completely perfectly behind in Earth's shadow as much as we can. Now, we also want to, though, choose lunar eclipses as close as we can find to the equinoxes. Now, unfortunately, those don't happen very frequently, so we're going to probably have to look over a couple hundred years.
Yeah, you have to get lucky for that, right? Or you just doesn't happen in your lifetime, then you can't do it.
Right. And even if you do, you probably won't find it exactly on the equinox, and you're not going to find it at the moment of equinox.
And you have to be in a location where it happens at your location.
Well, fortunately, a lunar eclipse can be seen anywhere in the world where it's nighttime.
Oh, that's right. It's the solar eclipses that are based on where you're at. Okay.
Yeah, it's the solar eclipses that are much more tricky to predict. Yes. Lunar eclipses are easy by comparison.
Yeah.
But nonetheless,
because what Hipparchus, the moon is compared to the sun. Yeah.
But the thing is, you're not going to have a lunar eclipse like right on the same day as the equinox. So what you're going to have to do is this. First, you're going to have to observe the moon as carefully as you can on a total lunar eclipse close to the equinox, and carefully measure where it is, probably with another base star. Hipparchus used Spica in Virgo, so Spica's back.
Nice.
It's all connecting, don't you worry. The house of bread back again. So he uses that measurement to know exactly where the moon is, and then he knows exactly where the sun is. Now, the thing is, though, the sun isn't exactly at the equinox, so he then has to basically adjust for that. And one of the things Hipparchus had done earlier was find out very exactly how quickly does the sun move against the zodiac itself, and he actually gets a much more precise measurement. So they already knew that there was more than 365 days in a year. They were saying 365 days in a quarter. Hipparchus does even more careful measurements and says, aha, I say it is 365 days, 1 quarter minus 1/300th of a day.
Wow.
So literally, he is getting the
Which
length
time
of the
period is
year.
Hipparchus again?
About 150 BC.
Wow. So he was really ahead of his time.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so he's... in fact, one of the things that apparently he helped work on and improve on was the armillary sphere. Apparently, an early version was built by Eratosthenes, the guy who figured out how big the Earth was. Used this for his own more accurate measurements of where the moon was, and also compared it to measurements of where the moon was also close to an equinox from centuries earlier from another astronomer, and then used that to figure out where the sun was and say, hey, it shifted about 2 degrees over 200 years. That's a precession rate of about 1 degree per century.
So do you think it's possible that if there is some astro-theology going on in the Bible, that they could have been using the works of Hipparchus?
Well, let's just say this much. It definitely won't explain the Old Testament because most of it's composed before Hipparchus is even like out of diapers or the equivalent of diapers for antiquity.
Yeah.
So we're definitely not going to explain in Zeitgeist they try explaining the golden calf or things like that and saying, oh, that's the age of Taurus. No, because that entire concept of astrological ages only can exist after Hipparchus's work and the discovery of this precession.
And his example for the age of Aries, blowing the ram's horn, is so. Think of how ridiculous that is. Jews blowing the ram's horn because are they all in on this, or they all don't know about this, but they're just doing it anyway? Like this
it's a combination of having super ancient traditions you're holding on to, but having absolutely no idea. And of course, if you talk to a rabbi, they can explain their traditions. They don't just say, we do it just because. No, there's a long story to just about everything they do. So if they aren't explaining the ram's horn with Aries the ram, then maybe you want to look for a better explanation.
Right. And by the way, there was, if you actually go into Assyriology, this is Dr. Joshua Bowen's big in this, you'll see that there's an idol. It's called the Ram in the Thicket. And there's there's thousands of these idols found all over the Middle East. And it must have been a really popular idol for ancient Babylonians and Assyrians because they all look like they're made the same way. It's a ram caught in a thicket. Now, the question is there a connection between the story of Abraham after he's about to kill Isaac? He looks over and sees a ram in a thicket. Well, we don't know, but all we do know is that all over the Middle East, in the city of Ur, especially when they dug up the city that Abraham was supposedly from, they found a bunch of these idols everywhere of a ram caught in the thicket. And they don't know if this is a god. They don't know if there's different theories. I mean, obviously people think different things, but all we know is that there's all these idols everywhere of a ram in a thicket. And sure enough, the Bible has a story of Abraham seeing a ram in a thicket. It could be coincidence, but it's almost like, are they just co-opting an old religious idea and just to give it a nod in the Old Testament? It seems like the Old Testament does that a lot. They'll take a god and make him a prophet or something like that. but the fact that to make this about Aries, the constellation, you really can't. There's really nothing there. It's other than it's a ram and then there's Aries. That's all you're really doing. You're taking an animal and connecting the two together because it's an animal. There's not a lot going on there though.
Yeah, and it's also out of proportion for what it's supposed to be this, because you're realizing, wow, the entire night sky has been shifted. Let's blow a horn, and that's how we're going to remember it.
That's what I was trying to get at. Is like the connection between blowing a ram's horn and the age of Aries is like, sounds a little bit of a stretch.
Yeah. Unfortunately, a lot of this with the ending of the age of Taurus is really just the beginning of the age of bullshit.
Right. Yep. Good point.
Now, there is the point, though, that you brought up. Could it still potentially be explaining things in the New Testament when Jesus is supposed to say, I'll be with you until the end of the age, and Jesus is supposed to be the age of Pisces coming and things like that? So in the source book for Zeitgeist, some evidence is trying to be given that, yes, indeed, the age of Pisces began right at the birth of Jesus. Now, the source he points to is on Wikipedia. So if you go there and look at what the source is being used there, the person who says it's 1 AD or 1 BC for the beginning of the age of Pisces is some guy living in the 20th century. And also, if you look on there, they'll see there's other astrological systems with completely different dates for the beginning and ending of these ages. Now, remember, the Zodiac is made up, and the boundaries.
There's no lines.
So where the lines are is also in some ways artificial. It doesn't actually correspond to the constellations.
Yeah, there's a lot of gray area. You can just point to a spot and say that's the line.
Yes.
You don't really know. There is no line, basically.
Well, the thing is, though, if we want to know where the line might be, instead of us speculating or us projecting onto it and say Jesus was so important, we're going to make the astrological age fit him because damn well we're going to do whatever we can to make this work. Instead, we can do the math, look at what the ancients have to say, and project back where they thought the vernal equinox was. And was the age of Pisces starting right around the time of Jesus? And we can do that math. And again, I am taking another figure from Neugebauer and Van Heusen. And what's going on here is they took a whole bunch of horoscopes from this important late 2nd century astrologer by the name of Vettius Valens. He lives in Syria, and he has a giant collection of horoscopes. he's actually in some ways trying to be a decent scientist because he's getting all this data and then trying to find correlations with it to try to figure out what does what. He's basically doing, in some ways, an unsophisticated statistical analysis.
Nice.
And so he has data over decades, and among the horoscopes he actually has is the birth horoscope for the Emperor Nero. So he's got some pretty, cool stuff to work with. And again, we can look at all the dates that he gives us. We can see where he plots things. And then when we try comparing where he says things are, and we use our modern computations, we can work back and see that error and figure out how things are drifting. Because remember how difficult it is to actually see the precession point, the equinox points, that you're not going to just see it with your sky, with the eyes. You basically have to require someone to go do these careful observations over centuries and then tell you where the points are and then include that in your mathematics. You can't go and independently do it on your own so easily.
Right.
So basically, we can use this sort of thing and see how he calculated this out and project back where this was. So what we see here is that basically the error between where the sun was at a certain time versus where it actually was. And you can see if we go to like around 40 or 50, 60 AD, there's an error of about 5 degrees, and that error gets smaller and smaller. And the slope of that line corresponds to this line that's drawn there. And that's the slope of the line you'd expect from actual precession.
Nice.
So we can actually, and this is what I love to do. I'm a data scientist professionally. What I love to do is take data and stick a line onto it. And when we do that,
you've been doing that.
I love my linear analysis. Regression. I love it. So this line can kind of help us, with some significant margin of error, where they thought the equinox point was as we go back further and further in time. So you notice around the year 50 AD, it's approximately at 5 degrees Aries,
You're right.
which means it's about 5 degrees away from Pisces. And if we go back to 0 or 1, I should say, AD, that gap is going to get a little bit larger.
So can I make a guess now? Is this actually happening in the 2nd or 3rd century, maybe? The actual 0?
So it depends on if you want to use the actual precessional rate or the precessional rate that Hipparchus first estimated, and then when Ptolemy tried improving on it, couldn't. Because according to Ptolemy, Hipparchus said the precession rate is 1 degree per century. Now, the actual rate is closer to 72 years for 1 degree of change. So it's a bit off, but if we just take their numbers, if we're saying very, very roughly around the time of Jesus, the equinox point was at the 5 degree point of Aries, means it has to move 5 more degrees to get into Pisces. At the precessional rate that astronomers believed at that time, it would have taken 500 years for the age of Pisces to begin. Which basically means if you take Revelation and say, beware, I come quickly, that can't be literal if it's supposed to be 500 years from now.
Wow. That's a good point. So when is this then? So what's the date for the precession for Pisces?
So with this sort of system, so if we're at basically 5 degrees Aries and we need to have it lose 5 degrees, and it loses 5 degrees every 72 years, just do 5 times 72. Let's see, that's 360. About 410 AD, very approximately.
We're a little off on with 0 being the age of Pisces.
Exactly.
That's so fascinating stuff right here. We just really went through this and did the work. And
this is what happens when we get to do the math. And of course, this also throws out the idea that Jesus being a fish or a fish representing Christianity comes from the age of Pisces idea. I'll also note that the history of using Pisces using a fish for a Christian symbol, we can date to like the late 2nd, early 3rd century.
Yeah, and I noticed that there is the word Pisces, ichthyos. I don't know.
Yeah, in the Greek.
That actually is a code for Jesus Christ, God's Son. I think it says Ix.
Ichthus is Jesus Christos, Hoios Theo Soter, Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior.
So when does that start happening, where they use the Pisces symbol as a secret code for Jesus? Is that 2nd century, you say?
Yeah, so our earliest evidence that people were even starting to do this. So you might be familiar with the sibling oracles.
Yeah, I love that. I have a copy in English. Yeah, I love that.
They are a very terrible thing to try to actually interpret and understand, because it's not by one author at one time. It's by
No,
Jews and Christians, written over centuries.
centuries, because they talk about Charles the Great, Charlemagne, and they're like,
Yeah.
okay, that's 800 AD. So obviously, some people are still writing this stuff in
Yeah.
the 9th century, which
Yeah,
means
it's
there's
a
no way
total,
this is that old.
yeah, it's a total mess. Now, some parts indeed are ancient. Now, in book 8 of the Oracles, if I remember correctly, we believe that has a Christian author, and one of the reasons is when you look at the poetry he's writing out, and every line he starts, with a certain letter for that. But if you then look down that column, it spells out Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior, and staros, the Greek word staros for cross. So it says basically in that column, Jesus Christ, the Son of God, Savior, cross.
Interesting.
We see the beginning of them trying to spell things out in this sort of way, and then later do we get the whole ichthus as the shortened form of that sort of thing.
Wow.
And we think the book, the 8th book, is like mid to late 2nd century AD.
which sort of matches up with the progression of Christianity itself, because we got to remember, Christianity didn't just plop on itself in one day. Hey, we got a whole Bible now. This is a progress. They had a couple gospels here, you had some Paul writings here, you got a couple different Syrian Christians over here, Egyptian Christians over here. It all comes together, I would say, arguably, in my opinion, around the 2nd century. I think
That's true. That's true. That basically, yeah, what you might try to term proto-Catholicism, with like Justin Martyr and things like that. That, yeah, you're basically right in the 2nd century where things have coalesced. By the time you get to Irenaeus, and now the 4 Gospels are basically supposed to be seen together as a unit and supposed to be treated and interpreted together. That, yeah, basically the 2nd century is in many ways where modern Christianity, in its quote unquote orthodox form, really takes hold. But the key thing then is this whole stuff about Pisces or fish being all Jesus-y. That's a late development. It's even post-gospel.
Interesting.
So you definitely don't use it to explain the origins of the Gospels.
Yeah, and and then which brings you back to the question: the fish symbolism. I'll make you fishers of men. Jesus feeds them with 2 fish and 5 loaves. What do you think that is from? Do you think that's just whatever? That's just the way they wrote the stories, or do you think there's something going on there?
That's a good question about the choice of symbolism. So, it also depends on how much of it's supposed to be historical memory. Was Peter actually a fisherman before he became a disciple? If we follow the Gospels, of course. If we go to Paul, he doesn't tell us anything.
Right.
It's hard to tell. And also it depends on, are you really going to take, like, say, First Peter is actually written by Peter or not? Because if it is written by him, this ain't some illiterate fisherman. This guy is a really sophisticated writer.
Right. Yeah.
But of course, for that reason, it's like, well, everyone says Peter was, unlettered. That's what it says in the book of Acts. So if we take that as true, then there's definitely no way he could have written this book or this letter the way he did. No way he could have articulated this or had derived things from the Greek translation of the Old Testament. This would require someone who's actually a well-read, learned person.
Yeah.
Now, like I say, I'm happy to follow the rest of scholarship and say that it's a forgery, so it doesn't go back to Peter. But on the other hand, if we could just say, well, maybe the Gospels are just making things up, then maybe Peter did write it, in which case he definitely wasn't a fisherman. And then why was he called that? And I don't have any good explanations for that. I'd have to investigate that much more thoroughly.
And that's the big question, is like, did he have a learned, trained scribe that did this for him? Like if you took somebody who's not who can't write in whatever, he's not like a author, but he wants to write a biography, he would go to a publisher and he would go to an editor and they would help him out. The question is, did Peter have that going on somehow? Who knows? But there's so many things at play that we don't know, and you have to sort of kind of guess, make things work. Otherwise, who knows?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. Now, I feel like for this presentation so far, we have been dunking on Zeitgeist and showing that its version of Astro-Theology just doesn't add up. We've literally done the math on the screen to see that it doesn't actually work. But it would be wrong for me to say that Astro-Theology just did not exist in antiquity. That would be mistaken.
Well,
but,
all you gotta do is read Seneca, and
Mhm.
Seneca lays it out. Oh, there's this thing called, he literally calls it the precession of the equinox. So,
Yeah.
I mean, at least,
But if it was interpreted religiously, that's a little bit hard to say. So, for example,
exactly.
the best case for precession being part of a religious cult goes to this guy.
Who's that? Oh, that's Mithra.
Oh, yes. And as you can
Right.
see, surrounding Mithra is what?
That is constellations,
Even more specific, that circle around him.
the Zodiac.
Hmm. So we definitely know that this cult was deep into looking to the stars and interpreting them and using as part of their religious sets of symbols. They
We
were doing
also
something
know,
like astrotheology.
we also know that a lot of the Mithraic cults converted to Christianity. Not saying that they all were Mithra worshippers who became Christians, but they used the locations. For example, some of the churches, some of the early churches underneath would have like Mithra carving, like stuff like we're seeing on the screen. So
Yes.
there could be a connection between the two.
Maybe so, but I mostly bring this up to just show that in antiquity, yes, some people were doing things astro-theological. What they interpreted from it is a little bit hard to say. And in particular, did they actually use the precession of the equinoxes as part of it? So the best case for that was done back in 1987, I think, was when David Ulansey writes his book, The Mysteries of the Mithraic Cult, and argues for the collection of symbols being used and the origins of it being shortly after the discovery of the precession equinoxes by Hipparchus, it being part of the cult for the king Mithridates, and then it comes to Rome by means of Pompey when he's basically marching around there and putting down pirates and things like that. Apparently there were these pirates in Asia Minor that were practicing the cult and that they brought that to Italy, at least according to Plutarch, and that he makes his argument based on those sorts of things. On the other hand, the top scholar for Mithraism, Roger Beck, doesn't buy that, and he thinks the religion is not that old, that it was actually a creation in basically like the mid-late 1st century AD in Rome, maybe even during the reign of Nero.
Yeah, it definitely became a Roman thing when you
Yeah.
talk about the difference between the Persian Mithra and the Roman Mithra. You could
Yeah,
see
it's
it.
definitely transformed from
Yeah.
whatever the original Persian form was. The only question is, was it originally transformed in Commagene or elsewhere in Asia Minor, as Ulansey is arguing, or was it a internally Roman creation? That I can't really argue very well. It's basically a matter of questioning which sources do we trust. So if Plutarch is right and Pompey is bringing this religion to Rome, then it had to have existed at least in the 60s BC. On the other hand, the oldest artifacts we find from Mithraism are found in Italy in the 1st century, late 1st century AD.
Nice.
So it's a question of like, which should we give more weight to? It's not an easy thing to determine. So the best case scenario is that this religion does involve the precession of the equinoxes in that, but it's also a good hypothesis. It's not something we can prove right now.
Very interesting. And it also makes you wonder if this is the same, if they're drawing their mythos from the Mithra that exists in Zoroastrianism, and maybe even going back even farther to the Mithra that exists in the Vedas.
Mm-mm.
But this all could be, it could be totally separate. You know, there's really no way to tell other than the name.
Right, yeah. And they also didn't really probably pull any of the astrology from the Zoroastrian cult because at the time that Mithraism begins, there really is no like innate astrology in Persia among the Zoroastrian priesthood. They basically had like some hymns to the sun, moon, and the star Sirius, but they had no love for the planets at all. In fact, when astrology was starting to actually become a big thing in Persia, starting in the 3rd century AD, we actually see in their literature balking at it in the same sort of way that Christians balk at astrology, for sometimes for similar reasons about fatalism and things like that.
Interesting. Now, let me ask you this. We're almost an hour and a half in. I'm wondering if you have, do you think we should divide this up into 2 parts, or do you think we can get through the, do you have a lot left? And this is just wondering.
It might be best, yeah, if we do a separate video and we talk specifically about.
Yeah, because I don't want to rush you. This is all amazing stuff. If we can slow this down into 2 parts, that's up to you.
Basically, like I have like one thing left I could show, or I could take that one thing and make it a whole nother discussion about where is astro-theology within Christianity? Because there are some places we can show there were Christian astro-theologians.
You know what then? Since we've been dunking on this the whole time and sort of debunking it, maybe we should have a separate, maybe we should save that for part 2.
I like that idea.
Let's go. Yeah, let's get into the good stuff for part 2.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, or at least where the stuff we can prove, because there are many other places where people think they see astrotheology as well, also by professional scholars, and we can weigh the evidence together.
That's going to be fun. So, yeah, if you have anything else you want to close up on what we've been talking about, floor is yours.
So I hope that when you guys say you do your own research, we can try to bring it up to this sort of level. When you see a claim, what can you personally go and do to actually show its truth or falsehood? If they say something is in the sky, go and see if that is actually true, whether with your own eyes or with a computer program, things like that. We have the tools to check these sorts of things, to dive deep and discover things for ourselves. And of course, we'll also find out that maybe some of our preferred beliefs don't hold up to scrutiny, but then the beliefs that are there, the ones that remain, are the ones worth holding on to.
Fascinating stuff. Like you said, when there's claims being made that are falsifiable, check. It's not that. And all you got to do is look, check it out.
And of course, when it comes to claims, I would recommend, of course, people try checking out the claims in this book and see if you can debunk them. I got to plug this one way or another.
Yeah, do that. That's awesome.
Because I discussed
before you debunk it, you have to buy the book first.
Oh yeah, and you'll learn even more about astronomy and astrology from back then and how people have tried to apply it to another part of the Christian story. But we can save those stories for the next round.
And I will leave a link in the description for the book. Also, it's in a comment pinned to the top. Check that out. Hit the like button. And you have just attained true Gnosis.
You have just attained true Gnosis. The demiurge has no power over you.